The room was already crowded when my sister said it. Folding chairs scraped against the floor as people shifted. Someone laughed too loud near the coffee urn. I was standing off to the side, half in, half out, the way you stand, when you're trying not to take up space. Then Natalie cleared her throat and said calm, as if she were suggesting a seating change. The best thing for this family is if you disappear forever. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't glare. She looked past me like the words were a formality she'd been carrying around and finally decided to set down. A few heads turned. A few didn't. The silence that followed wasn't dramatic. It was practical. People waited to see what would happen next, like they were watching a meeting move to the next agenda item. I watched my sister's face while the sentence settled. No hesitation, no second thought. She had rehearsed this. I could tell by the way she exhaled after, like she'd just finished a line she'd been practicing in the mirror. She glanced around the room, checking reactions, and found enough nods to keep going. No one spoke up. No one asked what she meant. No one said my name. I stood there long enough to notice small things. The hum from the lights. A woman smoothing the edge of a paper program. Someone's phone buzzing and then stopping. I waited for an interruption. I waited for someone to laugh it off. I waited for Natalie to add a qualifier. She didn't. She gave a small, satisfied smile and moved on, talking about logistics and timing as if she hadn't just erased a person. People have asked me later what that felt like. I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel hurt in a way I could point to. It felt like a decision had been made without me, and I had just been informed. That's the cleanest way to put it. I'd been on the receiving end of briefings like that before. This one just happened to be about my life. Natalie kept talking. She talked about schedules, about keeping things simple, about avoiding confusion. She said the word family a few times, the way people do when they want to sound reasonable. I caught a couple of eyes in the room. They looked away quickly, like they didn't want to be drafted into anything. That told me everything I needed to know about how much help I was going to get. I shifted my weight and thought about where I was standing. Not physically, structurally, that's how my mind works. Where are the supports? What's holding what? If you remove one piece, what collapses first? Natalie had just removed me from the diagram. The room accepted the change. Someone asked a question about dates. Natalie answered it. Someone else mentioned parking. She answered that too. The meeting kept moving, which was the strangest part. Life didn't pause for the sentence that had just been dropped. It adjusted around it. I said nothing. Not because I didn't have anything to say, but because I understood what speaking would do. It would turn this into a debate. It would give Natalie something to push against. I wasn't interested in pushing. I was interested in clarity. The room had given me that. At one point, Natalie looked back at me like she expected a reaction she could manage. I met her eyes and nodded once. Not agreement. Acknowledgement. The same nod you give when you've received an instruction. Her expression flickered for half a second. She hadn't planned for that. She recovered quickly. The meeting wrapped up without ceremony. Chairs folded. Coffee cups went into the trash. People clustered into small groups, already talking about other things. A couple of them avoided me. A couple offered tight smiles. No one stopped me. I took my coat from the back of the chair and walked out. Outside, the air felt colder than it had a few minutes earlier. I stood on the sidewalk and listened to the door close behind me. The sound was ordinary. That was the theme of the day. Ordinary sounds marking a change that wasn't ordinary at all. I checked my phone. No messages. That didn't surprise me. Natalie wouldn't text. She preferred witnesses. I put the phone back in my pocket and looked at my car. I'd parked farther away than usual. Habit. You don't know you're building habits until you notice them. As I drove, I replayed the sentence exactly as she'd said it. Not the tone, the words, the best thing for this family. Best implies options, a ranking. She'd ranked me. Disappear. Not step back, not take a break. Disappear forever. No expiration date, no path back. It was clean. I had to give her that. By the time I reached the highway, my hands were steady. That surprised me. I'd expected something louder inside my head. Instead, there was a quiet focus, the kind that shows up when a situation stops being emotional and starts being logistical. I merged, set the cruise, and let the traffic settle. At a stoplight near my place, I caught my reflection in the rearview mirror. I looked the same, no visible erasure. That's how these things work. You're still there, people just decide you're not. When I got home, I dropped my keys into the bowl by the door and stood in the kitchen without turning on the lights. The room smelled faintly like cleaner. I'd wiped the counters that morning before leaving the way I always did. I stood there long enough to notice that my breathing had slowed. I took off my coat and set it over the chair. I didn't sit. On the counter was a stack of mail I hadn't opened yet. Utility bill, bank statement, something with my name printed in bold. I moved the stack aside and cleared a space, not because I needed it right then, but because clutter bothers me when I'm thinking. I opened a drawer and took out a pen. It was the black one I use for paperwork. I clicked it once, then set it down again. I didn't make a call. I didn't send a message. I didn't rehearse an argument in my head. I walked to the window and looked out at the street. A neighbor was unloading groceries. Someone else was backing out of a driveway. Normal movement, normal pace. I stood there and let the idea settle that Natalie had just asked me to remove myself, and everyone had agreed. I turned back toward the counter and picked up the bank statement. Not to read it, to feel its weight. Paper is honest that way. It's there, or it isn't. I set it down, straightened the stack, and lined the edges up. Then I reached for my phone, not to call anyone, but to open the calendar. I scrolled forward a few weeks and stopped. I took a breath, the kind that comes before action, and rested my hand flat on the counter, feeling the cool surface under my palm. The house was quiet. Not empty. Quiet. And in that quiet, a single choice began to take shape. Not as a reaction, not as a speech, but as something practical that could be done carefully, one step at a time. I left my hand on the counter a second longer than necessary, then picked up the stack of mail and slid it into the drawer, where I keep things that need attention but not emotion. The habit came from work. You don't ignore tasks, you just put them where they belong until it's time to deal with them. The version of me standing in that kitchen didn't appear overnight. She was built slowly over years of early mornings and late nights through routines that didn't ask whether I felt like showing up. I joined the military in my early 20s because structure made sense to me. Clear expectations, clear accountability. If something failed, you traced it back and fixed the process. You didn't argue with the problem. I ended up in logistics because that's where I was useful. Planning, tracking, making sure things arrived when they were supposed to. It's not glamorous, but it's how operations actually work. People like to talk about leadership as inspiration. I learned it as follow-through. If supplies didn't show up, no one cared how motivated you were. My parents were still alive then. They worried the way parents do, but they trusted me. When my mother got sick, I was stationed 2 states away and learned how to schedule medical leave with the same precision I used for transport requests. When my father followed a year later, the house became quiet in a different way. He'd been the one who handled repairs paperwork, the little fixes that keep a place from falling apart. Natalie was already living there with her family. At first it made sense. She had kids, she needed stability. I was gone more than I was home. The decision to keep the house wasn't dramatic. It was practical. I had the credit. I had the income. I signed the documents because someone had to, and because I could. I didn't move in full time. I kept a small place near base and came back when my schedule allowed. When something broke, Natalie called me. When taxes were due, I handled it. When the roof needed work, I arranged it. None of that felt heroic. It felt like maintenance. The kind of maintenance that keeps things running quietly so no one notices. Over time, the language changed. Natalie started calling it the family house. People said we when they meant me. We'll take care of it. We've got it covered. I didn't correct them. Correcting people takes energy, and I had other things to spend it on. At work, I was trusted with budgets larger than the value of that house. I tracked expenses down to the dollar because that's how you avoid problems later. At home, I paid bills the same way. Mortgage, insurance, utilities. I didn't combine accounts. I didn't make speeches about fairness. I just paid what needed to be paid. Natalie never asked for details. She didn't need to. Things worked. The lights came on. The heat stayed on in winter. The yard got mowed. Her kids had space. That was the arrangement, even if no one ever called it that out loud. When I was home, I stayed in the background. I cooked when it was my turn. I fixed what was broken. I left early when I needed to get back to base. I didn't insert myself into decisions that weren't mine. That was a mistake, but it took me a long time to understand why. People mistake quiet for absence. If you're not loud about what you do, they assume it doesn't take effort. They assume it just happens. Natalie was good at filling rooms. She talked to neighbors. She organized events. She knew everyone at church by name. That visibility counted for more than the work no one saw. The house became part of her identity. I could see it in the way she spoke about it. Not ownership exactly, more like entitlement. She hosted gatherings without checking with me because why would she? I wasn't there. I never said no, which taught her she didn't need to ask. I noticed the shift, but I didn't address it. At work, if someone takes credit for something you did, you correct the record immediately. At home, I told myself it wasn't worth the friction. Family was supposed to be flexible. That was another mistake. The day of the meeting when Natalie decided to put words to what had been forming for a while, it didn't come out of nowhere. It was the first time she said it clearly. That's all. The room accepted it because it matched the version of reality they'd been living in. I was the background support. Easy to remove. Standing in my kitchen, I thought about all of this without running through it like a story. It came as a series of facts. I owned the house, I paid the bills, Natalie lived there. The community saw it as hers. The difference between those two things had never mattered before. I poured a glass of water and leaned against the counter, letting the cold sink in. I wasn't angry at Natalie for wanting me gone. Wanting things is human. I was interested in what happened when wanting met reality. In my job, that's where the work begins. I finished the water and set the glass in the sink. I checked my email out of habit. Nothing urgent. A calendar reminder popped up for a briefing later in the week. I acknowledged it and closed the app. The structure of my days didn't change because of one sentence, and that was comforting in a way I hadn't expected. I went into the bedroom and opened the closet. My uniforms were lined up pressed ready, civilian clothes on the other side, everything had its place. I ran my hand along the sleeve of one jacket, then closed the door. Order has a way of calming the mind. It reminds you that not everything is up for debate. Back in the living room, and I sat down for the first time since getting home. The couch dipped where it always did. I leaned forward, elbows on my knees, and looked at the floor. Not because I was overwhelmed, but because that's the posture you take when you're evaluating options. The situation wasn't complicated. It just hadn't been acknowledged. Natalie wanted me out of the picture. The room had agreed. The house was the picture. I had spent years keeping it stable without asking what would happen if I stopped. I stood up and walked back to the kitchen, pulled the bank statement from the drawer, and finally opened it. The numbers were familiar, predictable. They told a story that hadn't been spoken aloud yet. I folded the paper carefully and set it back on the counter, squared with the edge. The decision forming in my mind didn't feel dramatic. It felt necessary, the kind of decision you make when you realize a system isn't aligned with reality anymore. You don't get sentimental about systems, you adjust them. I picked up the pen again this time without clicking it and set it next to the statement. The room was still quiet. Outside, a car passed, tires hissing on pavement. I watched the light shift across the wall as the sun moved lower, and I felt the weight of years of maintenance settle into something simpler. For the first time since the meeting, I allowed myself a small private acknowledgement of what I'd been doing all along. I hadn't been absent. I'd been holding things together. And once you see that clearly, the next steps stop feeling personal and start feeling procedural. I slid the bank statement back into the drawer, closed it, and stood there with my palms on the counter, not thinking about what to say to anyone, but about what information I actually had. That's how decisions start for me, by inventory, not emotion. I didn't call Natalie, I didn't text, I didn't draft a message I'd never send. I opened a fresh note on my phone and typed the date and time of the meeting, then the sentence as she'd said it word for word. Not because I needed proof, because accuracy matters. You don't paraphrase instructions. At work, when something goes wrong, the first step isn't fixing it. It's documenting it. Who said what, when, in what setting? I've seen good people make bad assumptions because they skipped that step. I wasn't going to. I sat at the kitchen table and listed facts, not interpretations. Facts. The house was in my name, mortgage current, taxes paid, insurance active, Natalie and her family living there, no lease, no rent, utilities in my name, repairs arranged by me. Those weren't grievances, they were data points. I added another line, community perception, Natalie's house. That one stung a little, but I left it there. You don't delete inconvenient data. I set the phone down and went to make coffee. The machine gurgled and hissed. I watched it without rushing because there was no reason to rush. Nothing needed an immediate response. That realization was calming. Natalie had made a request. The room had endorsed it. The timeline was mine. While the coffee brewed, I pulled out a legal folder from the cabinet. It held documents I rarely needed but kept updated anyway. Deed, insurance policy, last appraisal. I flipped through to confirm what I already knew. Everything was clean. Everything was current. I closed the folder and put it back where it belonged. I took my coffee to the window and watched a delivery truck double park across the street. The driver hopped out, dropped a box, hopped back in. Efficient, no conversation required. I took a sip and thought about how often I'd solved problems by removing friction instead of adding force. Natalie liked force. She liked momentum volume agreement by default. That's why she'd said what she said in a room full of people. She didn't want a discussion. She wanted consensus, and she'd gotten it. I opened my calendar again and blocked off an afternoon 2 weeks out. No label, just time. You learn early not to announce intentions until you're ready to execute them. Plans change. Records shouldn't. My phone buzzed with a message from someone at work asking for confirmation on a shipment date. I replied with a thumbs up and a time window. The contrast wasn't lost on me. In one part of my life, people trusted me to keep things moving. In another, I'd been quietly written out. I didn't feel the urge to defend myself. Defense implies you're asking permission to stay. I wasn't interested in staying where I wasn't wanted. What interested me was alignment. If Natalie wanted me gone, then the system needed to reflect that. I sat back down and added another section to the note. What disappears if I do? Under it, I wrote nothing yet. Not because I didn't know, but because I wanted to be precise later. Guessing leads to mistakes. Mistakes lead to arguments. I wasn't planning to argue. Around noon, I took a walk around the block. Movement helps me think. I passed houses that looked like ours. Lawns trimmed, cars in driveways, people inside assuming things were stable because they always had been. Stability is often mistaken for permanence. When I got back, there was a missed call from Natalie. No voicemail. I noted the time and didn't return it. If she wanted to clarify her request, she could do it the same way she'd made it publicly. Private revisions don't count. I ate a quick lunch standing up, wiped the counter again out of habit, and opened my laptop. I searched for local realtors, not to call one, just to see who was active. Names, reviews, offices. I bookmarked a few. Research isn't commitment, it's preparation. I closed the laptop and sat still for a moment, hands folded, breathing even. This was usually the point where people talked themselves out of hard decisions by imagining conversations that hadn't happened yet. I didn't imagine any. Conversations are noise. Outcomes are clearer. The afternoon passed quietly. I answered emails, confirmed a meeting, took notes on a briefing that had nothing to do with my family. The world didn't bend around Natalie's sentence. That was important to remember. One part of my life had shifted. The rest remained intact. As the light outside changed, I picked up my phone again and reviewed the note. It was short, clean. It didn't read like a diary. It read like a report. I added one last line at the bottom: action required. No details yet, just the acknowledgement that information leads somewhere. I thought about calling a friend, then decided against it. Friends mean well, but they fill silence with opinions. I didn't need opinions. I needed accuracy and time. That evening, I laid out clothes for the next day, set my alarm, and washed the mug I'd used for coffee. Ordinary tasks have a way of keeping you honest. They remind you that control doesn't come from grand gestures. It comes from doing what needs doing without announcing it. Before bed, I stood in the doorway of the kitchen and looked at the counter again. The pen was still there, exactly where I'd set it. I moved it a few inches to the right so it lined up with the edge. Small adjustment, cleaner line. In the dark, with the house settled around me, I felt the difference between reacting and responding. Reacting is fast and messy. Responding takes longer and lands where it's supposed to. Natalie had reacted to her own discomfort. I was responding to a request. I turned off the light and walked down the hall, already aware that the notes I'd taken weren't an end in themselves. They were a baseline. A way to make sure that whatever came next would be based on facts that didn't shift when someone raised their voice. I woke before the alarm and lay there for a moment, listening to the house settle, then rolled out of bed and started the day the same way I always did. Routine is useful when you don't want your mind inventing problems that don't exist yet. I showered, dressed, and checked my calendar while the coffee brewed. Nothing on it suggested my life had changed. That was fine. I didn't need it to. At my desk, I opened the laptop and sent a short email to my unit confirming availability for the coming weeks. No explanation, just dates. Clarity keeps doors open. I closed the email and opened another window with the bookmarks I'd saved the day before. I wasn't committing to anything. I was mapping terrain. Disappearing, I realized, wasn't a single act. It wasn't walking out with a suitcase or making a speech. It was a series of small correct steps that removed support without creating chaos. Chaos invites intervention. I wasn't interested in being managed. Mid-morning, I called the bank from a quiet room and asked for a breakdown of the mortgage. The woman on the line confirmed the balance, the rate, the payment schedule. Her tone was friendly, efficient. To her, this was just information. That was the point. I thanked her and wrote the numbers down even though I already knew them. Next was insurance. I verified coverage, deductibles, renewal dates. Everything was current. I asked what changes would be required if occupancy shifted. She answered without curiosity. People do this all day, every day. It's only dramatic if you want it to be. I took a break and walked outside, phone in hand, noting the time. The air was crisp. A neighbor waved. I waved back. No one could see anything happening because nothing visible was happening yet. That's the advantage of moving early. Back inside, I pulled out the legal folder again and checked the deed, not to admire it, but to confirm names and dates. Ownership isn't a feeling, it's a line of text. I read it once carefully and put it away. No photos, no copies. Originals stay where they belong. Around lunchtime, Natalie texted, "We need to talk. No greeting, no context." I left it unread for a few minutes, then marked it as read without responding. I wasn't being rude, I was being accurate. There was nothing to clarify. She had been clear. I ate quickly and returned to my desk. I drafted a list titled Steps, Not Plan. Plans suggest flexibility. Steps suggest sequence. Step 1 was already done, information gathered. Step 2, professional input. I searched for a real estate attorney and bookmarked 2 names. Again, no calls, just preparation. In the afternoon, work pulled me in. A shipment was delayed. A vendor needed documentation. I handled it without thinking about my sister or the house. That separation mattered. It reminded me I wasn't acting out of distress. I was making an adjustment alongside everything else I managed. By late afternoon, I felt the faint pressure people describe as anxiety. I recognized it and didn't indulge it. Pressure often shows up when a system senses change. It doesn't mean the change is wrong. It means the system is paying attention. I returned Natalie's text with a single line, "I'm busy today." It was true. She replied almost immediately. "This isn't something you can just ignore." I didn't respond. Ignoring implies denial. I wasn't denying anything. I was proceeding. That evening, I drove past the house without stopping. Not to be dramatic, to observe. The lights were on, cars in the driveway, life continuing as expected. I noted the time and kept driving. You don't interrupt operations to announce an audit. At home, I opened the note on my phone and added more facts. Calls made, information confirmed, no commentary. The list was growing, and with it, my sense of control. Control isn't dominance, it's alignment between reality and action. I pulled up a calendar and blocked another afternoon this time. Labeling it appointments. Vague labels attract less attention if someone ever sees your screen. I sent a message to a colleague asking to swap a shift later in the month. He agreed without question. People are generous when you're reliable. The next morning, I called one of the attorneys I'd bookmarked. I asked about a consultation. He gave me a time. I wrote it down. We didn't discuss motives. He didn't need them. The law doesn't run on feelings. After that, I contacted a realtor with solid reviews and a quiet online presence. We spoke briefly. I asked about timelines, not outcomes. She answered in ranges and contingencies. I liked that. Certainty is usually a lie. Between calls, I did my job. Emails, reports, a briefing. I took notes and asked questions. No one noticed anything different. That told me I was on the right track. If your internal shift becomes visible too early, you've mismanaged it. Natalie called twice that afternoon. I let both go to voicemail. She left one message, then another, the second sharper than the first. I listened to them once, then saved them without responding. Voice carries emotion. Text carries intent. I preferred intent. In the evening, I organized a folder on my laptop and labeled it with the address of the house. Inside, I created subfolders: mortgage, insurance, taxes, utilities, repairs. Nothing inside them yet. Just structure. Structure invites order. I stood up and stretched, noticing how little tension I felt in my shoulders. That surprised me again. I'd expected this phase to feel heavier. Instead, it felt methodical. The way a checklist feels when you know you can complete it. I made dinner, cleaned up, and set out clothes for the next day. Outside, the street was quiet. Inside, everything was where it should be. I opened the note one more time and added a final line beneath the steps. No announcements. Before bed, I checked my phone. Another message from Natalie. "You're making this worse." I considered replying, then locked the screen and set it face down. Worse than being erased in a room full of people numb. Different. I turned off the light and lay back, aware that the space between being asked to disappear and actually disappearing was filled with choices most people never notice. Choices that don't make noise. Choices that remove one support at a time until what remains has to stand on its own. I parked a block away and walked the rest of the distance, hands in my pockets, eyes up. I wasn't trying to be discreet. I just didn't need to announce myself. The house looked the same as it always had. Fresh mulch along the walkway, a wreath on the door that Natalie rotated with the seasons. It had the curated look of a place that was lived in loudly and maintained quietly. I let myself in with the key I'd never given up. The lock turned smoothly. That alone told me how little attention anyone had paid to the mechanics of ownership. Inside, the air smelled like lemon cleaner and something baking. A television murmured from the living room. I stood in the entryway for a second, orienting myself, then stepped fully inside. Natalie wasn't there. Her husband was in the kitchen, scrolling on his phone, a mug in his hand. He looked up surprised, then recovered. "Hey," he said, like this was a coincidence. I returned the greeting and kept moving. No explanations, no small talk. I wasn't visiting. I walked through the house slowly, not out of nostalgia, but out of habit. You assess before you act. The floorboard near the hallway still creaked. The light over the sink flickered the way I'd meant to fix months ago. The thermostat was set higher than I preferred. Small details, familiar ones. On the dining table sat a stack of mail addressed to Natalie. Not forwarded, not shared. Mixed in were envelopes with my name pushed to the side. I separated them without comment and slid mine into a neat pile. The gesture was automatic. Ownership has a way of reasserting itself when you stop pretending it doesn't matter. I opened the utility closet and checked the panel. Labeled, clean. I'd done that myself after a power outage years back. In the garage, the shelves I'd installed still held tools Natalie's family used without knowing where they came from. I didn't touch anything. Observation, not intervention. People talk about houses like they're neutral. They're not. They record decisions. Who fixed what? Who paid for what? Who bothered to notice problems before they turned into emergencies? This house was full of my handwriting, even if my name wasn't spoken much inside it anymore. Natalie had gotten good at using we. We decided. We fixed. We paid. It's an easy word to hide behind. It smooths over imbalances. It turns contribution into atmosphere. I'd let that happen because it kept the peace. Peace, I'd learned, is often just deferred conflict. I sat at the kitchen table and opened my mail. Mortgage statement, insurance renewal, tax notice, all current, all in order. I stacked them carefully and placed them back in my bag. The house didn't know it yet, but these were the documents that defined it. Her husband glanced over, curious now. "Everything okay?" he asked. It wasn't concern, it was a temperature check. I met his eyes and nodded. "Just taking care of a few things," I said. "True enough." He went back to his phone. I walked down the hall and opened the spare bedroom. It had been converted into storage. Boxes, old furniture, nothing sentimental. I checked the closet rod, sturdy from the installation I'd done myself. The details mattered. If you're going to change a system, you need to understand how it's built. Back in the living room, I noticed new throw pillows. Natalie had a talent for surface changes. They made places feel refreshed without altering anything underneath. I wondered how often people confuse that feeling with stability. I didn't stay long. There was no reason to. I took one last look around the kitchen, noting the calendar on the fridge filled with Natalie's handwriting. Events, appointments, plans that assumed the house was a constant. Assumptions are dangerous when they're unexamined. Outside, I locked the door and slid the key back into my pocket. The weight of it felt different now that I was paying attention. I walked back to my car, noting the neighbor across the street trimming hedges. He waved. I waved back. To him, this was still Natalie's house. That perception would take time to correct. On the drive home, I thought about the first payment I'd made after my father died. Sitting at a small desk checkbook, open pen in hand. No ceremony, just responsibility. That responsibility hadn't expired because other people grew comfortable. At home, I spread the documents out on the table and arranged them by category. Mortgage first, insurance, taxes, utilities, repairs. The layout looked clean, logical. I took a photo of the arrangement for my records, then gathered everything back into the folder. I added a new section to the digital folder on my laptop and labeled it Occupancy. Under it, I typed a single line, no formal agreement. That wasn't an accusation, it was a fact. Facts don't argue back. I checked my email and saw a message from the realtor confirming availability for a walkthrough later in the week. I replied with a time, no urgency, just coordination. This wasn't about speed, it was about correctness. Natalie texted while I was typing. "You were at the house," a statement, not a question. I set the phone down and finished the email before picking it back up. I responded with, "Yes, nothing else." She replied almost immediately, "We need to talk about this." I didn't answer. Talking implies negotiation. There was nothing to negotiate. Natalie had already defined the terms when she asked me to disappear. The house was part of that request, whether she'd considered it or not. I made a note in my phone with the date and time of the visit. Not because I expected a dispute, but because timelines matter. Memory is unreliable. Notes aren't. That night, as I cleaned up after dinner, I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to name before. The house wasn't sentimental to me in the way people expect. It was familiar. It was useful. It had served its purpose. What mattered wasn't the structure. It was the assumption that I would always be there to hold it up. I dried my hands and leaned against the counter, feeling the solid surface under my palms. The word ours had been convenient while it lasted. Convenient words usually are. They smooth things over until someone stops paying attention. I picked up my phone again and scrolled through the messages from Natalie without opening them. The tone had shifted, less command, more urgency. That more than anything else told me the word ours was already losing its grip. I met the realtor on a weekday morning because weekends attract opinions. She walked the perimeter with a clipboard, asked practical questions, and took notes without looking at me for approval. I appreciated that. We talked about timelines, not outcomes. She measured rooms, checked the age of the roof, and asked when the furnace had last been serviced. I answered with dates, not stories. Inside, she opened cabinets and snapped photos. I watched the process like I would any inspection, quietly, hands behind my back, letting the checklist do the talking. When she asked about occupancy, I said the house was owner-occupied, by family, no lease. She nodded and wrote it down, no raised eyebrows, no advice disguised as concern. We sat at the kitchen table with the paperwork spread out, the same table where Natalie liked to plan events. The contrast didn't register on my face, but it did register. The realtor explained pricing ranges, market conditions, and what a clean sale looked like. I told her clean was what I wanted. She said that usually meant fewer conversations later. We both smiled at that. After she left, the house felt louder without her. The refrigerator hummed. The clock ticked. I gathered the brochures she'd left and slid them into my bag. On my way out, I paused at the door and checked the lock one more time. Old habit. Then I drove home and opened my laptop. I reviewed the listing draft that evening. The photos were honest, wide angles, neutral light. The house looked larger than it felt, which is the goal. I read the description once and edited a single line for accuracy. No embellishment. Accuracy sells better. I clicked approve and closed the browser. That was it. No speech, no announcement, just a status change that would ripple outward on its own. The sign went up the next morning. I didn't see it in person. A notification came through with a photo attached, the realtor's number, staked into the lawn where Natalie had planted tulips last spring. The red and white looked sharp against the green, functional, visible from the street, hard to ignore. My phone rang within the hour. Natalie. I let it ring, then it rang again. I let that one ring too. I set the phone face down and went back to work. You don't stop a process because someone noticed it. By midday, the text started. Short at first. What is this, then longer? You can't do this without talking to us. The language was interesting. Us, the word was back, trying to reassert itself. I read the messages once and didn't respond. At lunch, a colleague asked if I wanted to grab coffee. I said yes. We talked about a delayed shipment and a change in protocol. Ordinary things. The kind that remind you the world doesn't revolve around your family drama even when your family thinks it does. When I checked my phone again, there was a voicemail from Natalie's husband. His tone was careful, like he was walking across ice he didn't know the thickness of. "Hey, just calling to understand what's going on," he said. "We're getting some calls." I saved it and didn't reply. Calls, plural. That meant the sign was doing its job. That afternoon, the realtor emailed to confirm showing windows. I approved them all. More access meant faster clarity. Clarity reduces confusion. Confusion creates stories. I wasn't interested in stories. Natalie texted again. "This is humiliating." I typed a response and deleted it. Humiliation is what people call consequences when they're surprised by them. I set the phone down and finished a report. By early evening, the neighbor across the street had left a voicemail. Friendly tone, a little awkward. "Saw the sign," he said. "Didn't know you were selling." I smiled at the phrasing. People rarely know until they're told by a lawn sign. I didn't call him back. I drove past the house after work, slower this time. 2 cars were parked out front. The lights were on. Curtains twitched. Natalie had company. I didn't stop. There was nothing for me to say. At home, I opened the folder on my laptop labeled with the address and added a new subfolder, listing. Inside it, I saved the approval email and the showing schedule. I added timestamps. Organization has a way of turning anxiety into sequence. The next morning, my phone buzzed before my alarm. Natalie, again. I silenced it and got up, showered, dressed, coffee. The routine didn't bend for incoming panic. At work, someone asked me if I'd seen the local listings. No, I said. True, I didn't browse. I managed. By midday, the realtor texted to say the first showing went well. "Good interest," she wrote. I replied with a thumbs up. That was the extent of my commentary. Natalie showed up at my place that evening without calling. I recognized her car before she knocked. I didn't rush to the door. I finished rinsing a plate, dried my hands, and then opened it. She didn't yell. That surprised me. Her voice was tight, controlled, like she was afraid of what would happen if she let it slip. "You can't sell the house," she said. Not a request, a statement she wanted me to accept. "I can," I said, not defensive, accurate. "You're blowing this up," she said. "People are talking." There it was, the real concern. Not legality, not fairness, visibility. I stepped aside to let her see the entryway, the shoes lined up, the lack of chaos. "I'm doing what you asked," I said. She frowned, trying to find the angle she'd missed. "That's not what I meant," she said. "Meaning changes when outcomes arrive." I didn't argue semantics. "You asked me to disappear," I said. "Selling the house does that." Her mouth opened, then closed. She scanned the room as if looking for leverage. "We live there," she said. "The kids." "You live there because I let you," I said, still calm. "That hasn't changed yet." Yet, she repeated, catching the word. She latched onto it. "So we can fix this." Fix implies a return to the previous arrangement. I shook my head once. "The listing is live," I said. "Showings are scheduled." She stared at me like I'd spoken another language. "You didn't have to do it this way." "This way is quiet," I said. "You said quiet was better." She left without slamming the door. That was new. Outside, her car idled longer than necessary before pulling away. I closed the door and leaned against it for a second, not because I was shaken, but because it marked a clean boundary. The sign was up. The process was moving. Words were losing their power to redirect it. I checked my phone and saw a message from the realtor. 2 more showings booked for tomorrow. I replied, approved. I set the phone down on the counter, lined it up with the edge, and took a breath that felt less like relief and more like alignment. The house had entered a public phase. From here on, consequences wouldn't be hypothetical. They would be scheduled, photographed, and discussed by people who had no stake in Natalie's version of events. I woke to a string of notifications that read like a weather report. Nothing specific, just a change in pressure. Missed calls, a few texts with question marks. One message that started polite and ended clipped. Panic has a rhythm. It's uneven. It skips steps. Anger is louder, but panic spreads faster. I didn't answer anything before work. I packed my bag, checked my calendar, and left on time. The drive was quiet. At a stoplight, I watched a woman argue with her phone, then shove it into her purse like it had offended her. I took the turn when the light changed and didn't think about it again. By mid-morning, the realtor emailed a summary from the previous day. Strong interest, follow-up requests, questions about closing dates. I replied with short confirmations and added the email to the listing folder. Then I went back to a briefing that required my attention and delivered it without distraction. You can feel 2 things at once and still do your job. Natalie called during lunch. I let it go to voicemail. Her message was shorter than the last. We need to talk now. No context. No accusation. Urgency had replaced authority. That was new. The calls didn't stop after lunch. They multiplied. Her husband, a cousin I hadn't spoken to in years, a church friend who led with concern and slid into suggestion. I listened to one voicemail from the church friend because I was curious how the story was being framed. We're all just trying to understand, she said. Understanding is a popular substitute for accountability. I deleted nothing. I saved everything. By late afternoon, I noticed the tone shift in the messages. Less command, more bargaining. Can we slow this down? Is there a way to pause? Pausing is what people ask for when they realize momentum is no longer theirs. I didn't respond. Silence isn't cruelty. It's clarity when words would muddy the water. On the way home, I stopped for groceries. Routine again. A neighbor from Natalie's street was there standing by the apples. He nodded, then hesitated. Saw the sign, he said, like he was mentioning the weather. Didn't expect that. I nodded back. Things change, I said. He looked like he wanted to say more, then didn't. People rarely want details. They want reassurance that their assumptions were reasonable. I didn't offer any. At home, I set the groceries down and checked my phone. Natalie had sent a long text this time. It was a list of consequences framed as concerns. Kids, school, community. She used the word embarrassing twice. She didn't mention the sentence she'd said in the room full of people. Panic edits memory. I read it once and set the phone face down. I washed my hands and started cooking. The knife thudded against the cutting board. The sound was steady, predictable. While dinner simmered, I opened the folder on my laptop and added a new subfolder labeled Communications. I saved screenshots of the messages and voicemails with timestamps, not to build a case, to keep a record. Records calm things down. They don't argue. The realtor texted with an update, one party asking about early possession. I replied, no early possession. Boundaries work best when they're simple. Natalie showed up again later that evening, this time with her husband. They stood side by side at my door like a united front assembled on short notice. I opened the door and stepped back, letting them in without comment. Their eyes moved around my place, cataloging. People do that when they're assessing leverage. We're under a lot of pressure, Natalie said, skipping the greeting. People are asking questions. They usually do, I said. Her husband cleared his throat. We just need time, he said. Time had replaced control. This is happening too fast. It's happening at market speed, I said. That's normal. Natalie paced a step, then stopped. You didn't think about how this looks, she said. The word again. Looks. I thought about ownership, I said. And requests. She stared at me, searching for a reaction she could work with. You're punishing us. I shook my head once. I'm responding, I said, quietly. Her husband spoke up again, voice careful. We can make an arrangement, he said. Rent, something temporary. Temporary arrangements stretch. They fray, they turn into expectations. I'm not interested in creating new dependencies, I said. Natalie's composure cracked just enough to show fear. You're blowing up our lives. I met her eyes. You asked me to remove mine from yours. She looked away. Panic makes people avoid eye contact. It's not strategic. It's involuntary. They left without agreement, but with less certainty than they'd arrived. That was the difference between anger and panic. Anger wants a fight. Panic wants a pause. After they were gone, I stood in the doorway for a moment, listening to the sound of their car pulling away. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt informed. The reaction had confirmed what I already knew. The sign hadn't just listed a house. It had exposed how much of their stability depended on something they didn't own. The next morning, my phone buzzed with a message from a number I didn't recognize. A neighbor from the street where the house sat. Just checking in, it read. Didn't expect all this. I replied with a simple, I'm fine. It wasn't an invitation. It was a statement. At work, a colleague asked if I was distracted. No, I said. True again. Distraction pulls you away from tasks. This sharpened them. By midweek, the questions grew more specific. Closing timelines, access to the garage, storage. Natalie's messages shifted into logistics, as if she could steer the process by engaging it. Can we keep the shed until we move? What about the piano? I answered, none of them. Logistics belonged to the owner, and the owner had hired a professional to handle them. The realtor emailed to say interest was holding strong. Multiple parties, she wrote. Good position. I approved another showing window and closed the laptop. That evening, I sat at the table and wrote a short list on paper this time. Not steps, outcomes, house sold, possession transferred, utilities closed or reassigned. No commentary, just sequence. Seeing it laid out reduced the noise. Natalie called again later than usual. I let it ring until voicemail. This time her message was quiet. "I don't know what to do," she said. Panic strips people of scripts. I didn't call back. Not because I lacked empathy, but because empathy doesn't fix structures. Structures change when pressure meets reality and adjusts. I turned off my phone and stepped onto the porch. The air had cooled. Somewhere a lawnmower droned, then stopped. Ordinary sounds marking an extraordinary shift for people who had assumed permanence. Inside, I poured a glass of water and drank it slowly. Panic, I'd learned, sounds like urgency without direction. It fills the space where authority used to be. And once you hear it clearly, you can stop mistaking it for something that deserves negotiation. I set the glass down and wiped a thin ring of water from the table, then opened my laptop and created a new document without naming it. Labels can wait. Structure comes first. The file wasn't about proving a point. It was about accuracy. In my line of work, when something fails, you don't argue about motives, you assemble the record. Dates, amounts, sources, no adjectives, no commentary. The truth holds better when it's quiet. I started with the mortgage. Payment history by month pulled directly from the bank portal. Principal, interest, escrow. I copied the totals into a clean table and linked the statements as attachments. Then insurance policy numbers, coverage, periods, renewals. Taxes next. County receipts, timestamps, confirmation numbers. Everything in order, everything verifiable. Utilities followed. Electricity, gas, water, internet. Account holder me. Payment method me. I resisted the urge to annotate. Annotation invites debate. Data closes it. Repairs took longer. I dug through emails and invoices. Roof patch after the hailstorm. Furnace service call in January. The plumbing fix that happened while I was out of state. I added the contractor names and the dates, nothing else. If someone wanted to call and confirm, they could. I made it easy. I worked for hours without noticing the time. When my eyes got tired, I stood up and stretched, then sat back down. This kind of work is familiar. It narrows your focus and steadies your breathing. It replaces noise with sequence. Halfway through, my phone buzzed. I didn't check it. I finished the section I was in, saved the document, and backed it up to a secure folder. Then I checked the phone. 3 missed calls, 1 text that read, "Please." I set the phone face down again. The next section was labeled Education and Emergency Support. I hesitated for a moment, then proceeded. Tuition assistance during a gap year, a car repair paid on short notice, a medical bill that had come due when Natalie's husband changed jobs. I included amounts and dates, not reasons. Reasons invite revision, amounts don't. At the bottom of that section, I added a subtotal, not bolded, just there. I paused and considered whether this was too much. Then I remembered the room where Natalie had asked me to disappear and the way everyone had accepted it without asking what that would remove. This wasn't too much. This was complete. I added a final section titled Summary. 3 lines, total contributions by category, total overtime, no conclusions. The document was clean, unemotional. It didn't read like an accusation, it read like an audit. I saved it, then opened a fresh page and typed a letter. 1 page. No greeting that suggested warmth I didn't feel. No apology, no threat. I was asked to disappear, I wrote. This is what disappears when I do. I explained briefly that the attached record reflected support I had provided quietly over time. I wished them well with the transition. I signed my name, no flourish, no postscript. I printed everything once, then again. 1 copy for my records, 1 for the house. I slid the pages into a black binder with tabs labeled to match the sections. The kind accountants use. Durable, boring, perfect. Before closing it, I flipped through each tab to make sure nothing was out of order. Order matters. It's a form of respect for the reader and for the truth. I didn't plan a reveal. I didn't coordinate a moment. I checked the listing schedule and saw a gap before the next showing. That would do. The house would be empty then, or as close to empty as it ever got. I packed the binder into my bag and drove over without calling ahead. The driveway was clear. Inside, the house smelled faintly of cleaner again. Natalie had been preparing for showings the way she prepared for everything surface first. I walked straight to the kitchen and set the binder on the counter centered. I placed the letter on top. The contrast was stark. Glossy counters, matte black binder, plain envelope, nothing decorative. I stood there for a moment longer than necessary, not to savor it, but to be certain. This wasn't a trap. It was information placed where it belonged. I didn't open drawers. I didn't look around. I locked the door behind me and drove away. Back home, I filed my copy and updated the digital folder with a note binder placed. Date and time. That was all. That evening, I cooked and cleaned and checked my email. The realtor wrote to say an offer was likely. I replied with a request for details. Business as usual. My phone rang later. Unknown number. I answered this time. Natalie's husband's voice came through tight and low. "What is this?" he asked. "It's a record," I said. "Open it." There was a pause, paper shifting, a breath pulled in and held. "I didn't know," he said. "That's why it's written down," I replied. In the background, I heard Natalie's voice rise, then cut off. He spoke again, quieter. "She says this is manipulative. It's documentation," I said. "There's a difference." He didn't argue. He asked a practical question about the timeline. I answered it. He thanked me not warmly but sincerely. The call ended without resolution. I sat for a moment after phone in hand, listening to the hum of the refrigerator. The file had done what it was supposed to do. It had shifted the conversation from feelings to facts. Messages came in after that. Some angry, some pleading, some confused. I didn't respond. The binder didn't need reinforcement. It could stand on its own. Later, as I prepared for bed, I realized something else had shifted. The panic in the messages had changed tone, less urgency, more recalibration. When facts enter a room, people stop improvising. I turned off the light and lay down, already aware that the record I'd prepared wasn't an ending or a punishment. It was a boundary made visible, set in a form that didn't rely on my presence to explain itself. I woke up with the sense that something had already moved without me touching it. Not anxiety momentum, the kind you feel when a process has passed the point where explanations matter. I made coffee, checked the calendar, and saw the showing window had closed overnight. The house would be quiet for a few hours. That mattered. I didn't drive over right away. I answered emails, approved a purchase order, joined a call that ended early because everyone came prepared. Preparation has a way of shortening conversations. When I left the house, it wasn't to stage anything. It was to verify placement. The kitchen was empty when I unlocked the door. No voices, no television. The counters were bare except for the binder exactly where I'd set it. Centered, square. The envelope still on top, unbent. Nothing had been moved. That told me no one had tried to handle it privately. People avoid what they can't spin. I didn't touch it. I walked through the rooms, once checking nothing, noting everything. The house felt different without people in it. Not sad, neutral. Structures don't feel abandoned. They feel unused. The difference is important. Outside, a car slowed, then kept going. Curiosity without commitment. I locked up and left again, already aware that the quiet wouldn't last. The call came mid-morning. It wasn't Natalie. It was someone I'd met twice and never expected to hear from directly. Her husband's voice was flatter than it had been the night before. Less heat. More processing. "She read it," he said. "All of it." I assumed, I said. "She's saying you did this to embarrass her." "I wrote it to document," I said. "Embarrassment isn't a category in the ledger." He exhaled. "People are asking questions." "They will," I said. "The answers are there." There was a pause. I could hear movement on his end papers, maybe, or the sound of someone pacing just out of frame. "Did you mean for others to see it?" "I put it in the house," I said, "where decisions were made." He didn't push back. "The neighbors noticed," he said. "Someone asked if it was okay to look." "That's up to the owner," I said. Another pause. Then quietly, "I didn't know you paid for all of it." "That's why it's written down," I said again. When the call ended, I didn't feel relief. I felt alignment. The binder was doing its job without commentary from me. That's what good documentation does. It replaces argument with reference. By early afternoon, the realtor texted to say an offer had come in. Clean, close to asking, reasonable timeline. I asked for the details and set a reminder to review them later. Business continued. Natalie's messages resumed, but they read differently now. Less accusation, more defensiveness. She quoted lines from the letter without context, as if isolating them would change their meaning. She asked who else had seen the binder. I didn't answer. Visibility isn't something you control, once you place facts in a shared space. A church friend emailed next. Polite subject line, concerned tone. We heard there's some confusion, she wrote. Confusion is what people call clarity they didn't expect. I didn't respond. I drove past the house again that evening. 2 people stood on the sidewalk near the mailbox, pretending to look at their phones. When I slowed, they straightened, then looked away. I didn't stop. I didn't need to. The binder had become a focal point, and focal points attract attention without instruction. Inside, the lights were off. The binder was still visible through the window, a dark rectangle against a pale counter. I kept driving. At home, I opened the offer and read it carefully. Terms, conditions, dates. I marked questions and sent them back to the realtor. The work was familiar, calming. The next morning, the phone rang early. Natalie this time. I let it ring, then answered on the 3rd try. Her voice was tight, controlled in a way that suggested rehearsal. Why would you put all of that in writing? She asked. So it wouldn't change, I said. You're making me look like a villain, she said. I didn't assign roles, I said. I listed payments. You could have talked to me. I listened, I said. In the room. She went quiet. Silence has different textures. This one was brittle. Everyone's talking, she said finally. I didn't start that, I said. I finished something. She accused me of timing, of intention, of cruelty framed as thoroughness. I let the words pass. Accusations require an audience to work. I wasn't one. When she stopped, I said, the offer is in review. Showings are continuing. That's where this is. You're not even there, she said. You just dropped this and left. I was asked to disappear, I said. Dropping records doesn't require presence. She hung up without saying goodbye. By midday, messages from others started arriving with a different tone altogether. Short, neutral, didn't know. Makes sense now. That must have been a lot. None of them asked me to fix anything. That's how you know the story has shifted. When people stop asking for solutions and start recalibrating their assumptions. The realtor called to say the offer would likely be revised upward. Interest had increased. The house shows well, she said. And the documentation helps. I smiled at that. Transparency sells. In the afternoon, I received an email from Natalie's husband. It was brief. Apologetic without being dramatic. I should have asked more questions earlier, he wrote. I'm sorry, I replied with a single line. Thank you for reading. I didn't forward the email. I didn't save it to the communications folder. It wasn't evidence. It was acknowledgement. Those don't need archiving. That evening, I sat on my porch and watched the light fade. Somewhere down the block, someone laughed. A car door closed. Ordinary sounds. The kind that remind you life keeps moving even when narratives fall apart. I checked the digital folder one last time and added a note beneath the binder entry. Scene. No names, no drama, just confirmation. Inside, I poured a glass of water and set it on the table, careful not to leave a ring. The house around me was quiet in a way that felt earned, not empty, ordered. I didn't think about what people would say next or how long the ripples would last. The facts were already where they needed to be, doing the work they were designed to do, standing in the space where I no longer had to explain myself. I didn't go back to the house again. There was no need. Once facts settle into a place, they don't require supervision. I focused on work, the kind that keeps your hands busy and your head clear. A procurement review, a routing adjustment, small decisions that add up. The day moved forward without asking my permission. The realtor called mid-morning. The revised offer was in. Better terms, shorter inspection window, standard contingencies. I asked one question about timing and approved the counter she recommended. We spoke in numbers and dates, no adjectives. When we hung up, the call log looked like any other workday. Messages continued to arrive, but they'd changed shape. The urgency had drained out of them. What replaced it was something quieter, recognition maybe. People weren't asking me to explain anymore. They were updating me on what they'd learned, as if information flowed both ways by default. A neighbor from the street where the house sat sent a short text. Didn't realize how much you handled. Makes sense now. I replied with a thank you and nothing else. Explanations invite debate. Acknowledgements close loops. At lunch, a colleague asked if I'd heard the phrase quiet quitting. I laughed and said no. He explained it half joking, half serious. I told him some people confuse quiet with absent. He nodded like that made sense and changed the subject. That afternoon, the church email chain made its way to me by accident. Someone had hit reply all. I read it once. Words like misunderstanding and healing floated around without attaching to anything specific. A few people asked whether the family needed support during the transition. No one asked me to attend a meeting. That omission spoke louder than an invitation would have. Natalie stopped calling. Her husband sent one more message about logistics move-out timing access for showings. I forwarded it to the realtor. Professionals handle logistics best when they're allowed to. I didn't add commentary. By the end of the week, the house was under contract. The inspection report came back clean with a minor note I'd already anticipated. I authorized the repair credit and moved on. The calendar adjusted itself around closing dates and transfer times. Systems like clarity. I drove past the street once not out of curiosity, but because it was on my route. The sign was still there, but it looked different now, less provocative, more administrative. A fact, not a statement. 2 people stood near the sidewalk talking. When they noticed my car, they nodded. No awkwardness, no whispering. The binder had done its work. The narrative had shifted from rumor to record. At home, I packed a few things I'd left scattered around: documents, spare keys, a folder I no longer needed. I labeled a box house and put it by the door. Not everything needs a permanent place. Some things are transitional by design. An email arrived from someone I barely knew, a parent of one of Natalie's kids' friends. Just wanted to say I understand now, it read. That must have been heavy. I didn't respond. Understanding doesn't require acknowledgement to be real. Work pulled me into a longer meeting than expected. When it ended, I realized I hadn't checked my phone in hours. That felt like progress. I reviewed the closing checklist the realtor had sent and confirmed the final walkthrough date. Everything lined up. That evening, Natalie's name appeared on my screen again. One message. I didn't think you'd really do it. The sentence sat there without punctuation, as if she'd run out of energy before finishing the thought. I read it and put the phone down. Doing things quietly tends to surprise people who rely on noise. I cooked dinner and ate standing at the counter looking out at the street. A couple walked their dog. Someone waved. I waved back. The world kept pace. Later, an email came from Natalie's husband. Short, measured. We're making plans to move. Thanks for coordinating through the realtor. I replied with a single line. That's best. The final inspection happened on a Friday morning. I didn't attend. The realtor sent photos and a checklist. Everything passed. I approved the release and added the confirmation to the folder. The process moved closer to done, without requiring my presence. By the weekend, the conversations I overheard at the store at a coffee shop had changed. The tone wasn't scandal anymore. It was summary. People talking about what actually happened. Facts have a way of flattening drama into timelines. I didn't feel vindicated. Vindication suggests a contest. This hadn't been one. It had been an adjustment long overdue. When people finally understand something, it doesn't arrive with applause. It arrives with quiet recalibration. On Sunday, I cleaned my place top to bottom. Not because it needed it, but because movement helps mark transitions. I rearranged a shelf, donated a jacket, threw out papers that no longer mattered. The box by the door stayed there, waiting for its next destination. That night, I reviewed the closing documents one last time. Names correct, numbers accurate, dates aligned. I signed where indicated and sent them back. The email confirmation came through minutes later. Received, scheduled, done. I sat back and noticed the absence of tension in my shoulders. Not relief, something steadier. The sense that a weight had been set down because it was no longer mine to carry. Natalie didn't message again. No apology, no confrontation, just silence. Silence this time wasn't power. It was acceptance. I stepped outside and looked up at the sky, clear and unremarkable. Somewhere behind me, my phone chimed with a calendar reminder for the following week. Another meeting, another set of tasks. The ordinary rhythm resumed uninterrupted. Inside, I turned off the lights one by one and paused at the doorway, listening to the quiet settle. The house around me wasn't the one I was selling, but it felt more like home than anything had in a while. Not because it held memories, but because it held nothing that depended on me without permission. The morning of the closing didn't feel special. That was the first thing I noticed. No spike in adrenaline, no urge to check my phone every 5 minutes. I made coffee, reviewed a short checklist, and drove to work like any other day. The calendar reminder sat there quietly, doing its job without drama. During a break, I signed the final documents electronically. Names, numbers, dates. I paused once to confirm an address corrected a typo, and submitted. The confirmation came back almost immediately. Efficient systems reward preparation. I closed the browser and returned to the task in front of me. Later that afternoon, the realtor emailed a photo of the keys on a counter I recognized. Recorded, she wrote, "Funds dispersed." I replied with a thank you and archived the thread. The transaction had moved from active to complete, and my role shifted with it. I didn't drive by the house. I didn't need the visual. Ownership had already changed in the places that mattered: records, accounts, responsibility. Seeing it one more time wouldn't add clarity. It would only invite memory to pretend it had a claim. Over the next few days, I closed utilities, updated insurance, and forwarded mail. Each action removed another thin thread connecting me to a structure I'd been holding up for years. None of it felt like loss. It felt like completion. Natalie's husband sent a brief update through the realtor confirming their move-out date. Professional, neutral. I approved access for the final walkthrough and left it at that. When people shift to logistics, they've accepted the new shape of things. Work filled the space easily. A planning session ran long. A delivery arrived early. Someone asked for my input on a process that had been limping along for months. I gave it, and the room adjusted. That familiar rhythm reminded me how little of my identity had actually been tied to the house. What I'd been carrying there was responsibility, not belonging. One evening, I sorted through the box by the door, the one labeled house. I kept what mattered: documents, a spare key that no longer opened anything. A small tool I'd meant to return to the garage years ago. The rest went into recycling. Paper doesn't complain when you let it go. A message came in from a neighbor I'd always liked. "We'll miss seeing you around," it read. I replied, "Take care." There was no need to explain where I'd gone. I hadn't vanished. I'd just stopped orbiting a place that assumed I would. I started looking at smaller places near my work. Not urgently, casually. A one-bedroom with a porch. A place that needed nothing from me except rent on time. I toured one on a lunch break and signed the lease that afternoon. The decision felt obvious once it was made. The first night there, I sat on the porch with a glass of water and listened to traffic pass at a distance. The space was quiet without being empty. No calendar on the fridge filled with someone else's plans. No mail addressed to other names. Just my things where I put them. Natalie didn't reach out. That was fine. Closure doesn't require conversation when the terms are clear. Silence this time wasn't a tactic. It was the absence of expectation. A week later, a direct deposit notification arrived. Proceeds from the sale, clean and final. I transferred part of it to savings, paid down a balance I'd been meaning to address, and left the rest where it was. Money behaves better when you don't assign it emotional jobs. At work, someone congratulated me on a recent project and asked how I managed stress. I told him I separate noise from signal. He laughed like that was a joke. It wasn't. I ran into a church acquaintance at the store one afternoon. She hesitated, then said, "I hope you're okay." I nodded. "I am." She looked relieved, as if that settled something for her. It did. Weeks passed without incident. Seasons shifted. Leaves collected along the curb outside my new place. I raked them once and didn't mind. The task took exactly as long as it needed to, and no longer. One night, while organizing a drawer, I found the pen I'd lined up on the counter weeks earlier. The black one I used for paperwork. I turned it over in my hand, then placed it back where it belonged. Tools don't disappear when you stop using them. They wait. I thought about Natalie occasionally, not with anger, but with distance. Distance is different. It allows you to see patterns without stepping back into them. I hoped she learned something from the record. I hoped she didn't need to lose more to understand it. That hope didn't require follow-up. A coworker asked if I wanted to join a group hike on the weekend. I said yes. We walked a trail that didn't demand much, talked about nothing in particular, and finished before noon. I spent the afternoon reading and doing laundry. Ordinary life has a way of filling space when you stop overcommitting it. I noticed how my shoulders felt when I woke up now, how my breathing settled faster, how decisions arrived without friction. None of that came from winning anything. It came from putting boundaries where assumptions had been. People sometimes ask what disappeared when I left. The easy answer is money, access, convenience. The accurate answer is weight. The weight of being the silent fix. The weight of being the last call when something broke. The weight of keeping peace by absorbing imbalance. What didn't disappear was me. I kept my routines, I kept my standards, I kept my time. The rest adjusted accordingly. One evening, I sat on the porch again and watched the streetlights come on one by one. The sky was clear, the air was cool. Somewhere down the block, someone laughed, then quieted. Life continuing at a reasonable pace. I finished the water, set the glass down, and went inside without looking back. 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 Inside without looking back.